In tonight's Government Insider, the effort to reshape federal workers' rights. Congress is considering legislation that would make it easier to fire feds and delay pay raises. It's happening at the Departments of Veterans Affairs, the IRS, and DOD. For more, I'm joined by Joe Davidson, Federal Diary columnist at the Washington Post. Joe, let's start with the Department of Veterans Affairs. This is not a new effort. I assume the push for change at the VA is due to the recent scandal in patient wait times?
That's right. That scandal, which broke last year, generated a lot of activity on Capitol Hill, as you well know, and some of that activity was directed at employees of the VA, which is one of the largest departments in the federal government. All of these things that you mentioned don't necessarily apply to each of those three agencies, but there are some similarities, there is some overlap, and I think together you can certainly detect a pattern in the way that Congress is acting toward its workforce. At the VA, for example, legislation would allow employees to be fired more easily through a longer probationary period during which employees have fewer workplace protections. There's an effort to rein in their bonuses if they were involved in the struggle that would limit their pay.
Yeah, let me interject. We're seeing Eric Shinseki on the screen right now. He was part of the overall purge of the agency, and keep going on. So with the VA, we know why it happened politically and the fact that they just weren't doing their job, but how did the IRS and DOD become part of this overall push?
Well, the IRS also had its fair share of scandal, as you know. And so I think to some extent this is a punitive effort because Congress has also cut the budget for the IRS. At the Defense Department, I think it's not a result of scandal. I think it's just a matter of trying to rein in expenses, and in this case, do it at the expense of the employees if this legislation is approved.
Now, map out the major players here, Joe. Who supports these changes and who opposes them?
Well, broadly speaking, they are supported by the Republicans in Congress, but there's also Democratic support on the Hill for these. This isn't strictly a partisan effort, although it's generally led by the Republicans. Many Democrats, particularly from the local area, support the federal workers and are opposed to these kinds of attacks. So the local delegation from Maryland, Virginia, and the district, those members are among the leaders in the Democratic Party who oppose this. And of course, the federal unions and federal employees generally are definitely opposed to things that would make it easier for their members to be fired or things that will limit their pay raises.
Now, I can understand the IRS being political and punitive to get back at them, but the DOD was basically, according to a lot of observers, just incompetent at what it was doing. But even now you're saying that it's still a political game for the VA because that ship's got to be tightened up, I would think.
Well, for the Defense Department, I don't think that anybody's getting back at them for any particular failures or scandals.
But the VA I'm talking about. I can understand why they want to fire some people at the VA.
Oh, well, certainly. There are definitely people who are probably deserving of being fired. The question is, do you allow them due process, which public employees generally have been entitled to, because this whole due process thing began so that agencies wouldn't be loaded up with political appointees who could be fired and replaced every time a new person took office.
Good point.
And so that's the reason that public employees have due process rights. And so the notion that you can undermine and do away, well, not totally do away, but certainly severely undermine due process has really struck a lot of people the wrong way, a lot of people on the Hill and certainly within the employee ranks.
Right, I understand. Now, even if Congress, Joe, passes a law, it needs President Obama's signature. If Obama vetoes the law, Congress needs enough votes to override. Who's got the momentum?
Well, Obama, although he's been a friend to federal employees, wouldn't necessarily veto these pieces of legislation if they are part of a larger bill. For example, due process rights for senior executives in the VA were severely undermined a year ago. And that was part of a larger VA reform bill that also grew out of that scandal. And that measure was signed into law. It was passed by a bipartisan majority and then signed into law by the president. So if these measures went to him as standalone legislation, maybe he would veto them. But if they go to him as part of a larger bill that he feels is necessary, then he might simply sign them just as he did with the senior executive measure last year.
Right. Joe, you've covered the federal workforce for a long time now. Put this story into historical context.
Well, for years, Republicans in particular have sought to limit the pay for federal employees. Again, not just Republicans, but it was President Obama who initially proposed the pay freeze that resulted in a 3-year pay freeze on basic pay rates for federal employees. But I think that this effort to kind of undermine or cut back on the due process rights really did take off last year when they in fact did that for the senior executives at the VA, as I mentioned.
All right, it's good to get your insight. Joe Davidson, Federal Diary columnist at The Washington Post. Thanks again, Joe.
Thank you.